Hi, I'm Salazar and I'm going to talk about Web Accessibility Guide for Beginners. But before we dive in, I would like to introduce myself. I'm Salazar. I've been a front-end developer for 7 years now, and I'm specializing in accessibility. And now let's start. What is accessibility? Accessibility is the universal access to the web. That means that anybody can access to our website, no matter their circumstances or their disabilities. There are many types of disabilities. For example, someone who is blind, or someone who is deaf, or someone that has a motor impairment. People with disabilities might encounter some situation in which it's difficult for them to use a computer or a website. That's why assistive technologies were created. Assistive technologies are pieces of software or hardware that helps people with disability interact with these devices. There are many kinds of them. For example, a braille keyboard, such as the one we can see on the screen, or a screen reader. A screen reader is a device that tells you out loud what is happening inside of a website, so you can move through this website using your hearing. Now that we understand a little bit more about accessibility, how can we create accessible websites? Well, I would like to start with colors. If I create a website like this, not only is it going to be really awful, but also it's going to be pretty difficult to read. Why is that? Because the colors we have chosen, the background color and the text color, are not different enough. They don't have enough contrast ratio, so yeah, they are really difficult to read. When we are starting to design our websites, it's really important that we take into account that the colors we have chosen, they might have enough contrast ratio. However, when we're talking about accessibility and colors, there's one more thing I would like to talk about, and it's this. Let's imagine for a moment that I have created a marvelous form. The aim of this form is that a user can register on a website. What happens if the user is filling out all these inputs, but he has forgotten to fill out, for example, the name input? Well, in order to tell him that he had made this mistake, I changed the border of the color to red. But what if this user is colorblind? He might see it as red or gray, or it depends on the color blindness he has. And what if this user has any visual impairment? He won't understand what happened because we are only communicating to the user using color. That's why when we want to communicate some information to the user, we don't rely only on colors. What can we do? Well, for example, I have added a sad face icon and a text that explains what happened. This way, if the user is colorblind, he might not be able to see that everything is red, but he will be able to notice the sad face icon and he will be able to read the text. And if the user has any visual impairment, he won't be able to see that everything is red or the sad face icon, but he will be able to read this error text because the assistive technology will read this text. So now we understand that we have to use colors in a responsible way, and that we must keep in mind that we have to check the colors that have enough contrast ratio. Now I would like to talk about keyboard navigation. Imagine for a moment that you have broken up your arm, or that your mouse has run out of batteries, or that you simply cannot move your arm because whatever. How can you navigate through a website if you cannot use your mouse or your trackpad? That's why all websites should be keyboard navigable. How does this work? Well, basically a website is keyboard navigable if you can move through the elements of a website using your keyboard. If you can move through the elements forward with the key tab, and you can move backwards with the key tab plus the key shift, and if you can activate buttons or links with the key shift. I'm going to show you a little demo. As we can see, there is a box surrounding cast and crew. This box is telling us which is the element that has the focus, which is the element that we are interacting with. And this box can move forward, can move backwards, and when we stay on one place and we press the key enter, we activate this element. This element was a link, so we go to another page. So yeah, this website is fully keyboard navigable. However, creating a website that is fully keyboard navigable can be a little bit tricky. We have to take into account a few things. Firstly, we were seeing that the box surrounding the element was telling us which is the element that we're interacting with. So it's really important that this mark is always visible, because if we hide it, the person that is trying to interact with the keyboard might be a little bit confused. Sometimes the design team doesn't like that when one element receives the focus, they change their appearance. So we place on our CSS outline none when the element receives the focus, and well, we hide it. But this is a really big mistake, because if someone is interacting with the keyboard and is not able to know where he is, he can be confused. So keep this in mind. Secondly, what elements do receive the focus? Well, the interactive ones, because it's not pretty useful that a P tag receives the focus when we can't do anything with a P tag. Interactive elements are links or buttons or forms elements such as input, selects, or text area. And lastly, in what order do these elements receive the focus? That's what we call tab order. Well, tab order depends on how we're reading our HTML. For example, in this piece of code, the first element that is going to receive the focus is home, the second is list, and the third is profile. So we have to write our HTML in a logic way, because otherwise people can be confused. What is more, we should never change the order of the elements with CSS, because if we do that, we might see the elements in one order and they might receive the focus in a different one, and that can be pretty disturbing for someone that is navigating with a keyboard. Now we know how can we create websites that are keyboard navigable. Let's talk about semantic HTML. What is this? HTML has some tags that carry meaning, that tell us what type of information they have inside of them. This is pretty useful for assistive technologies, because thanks to semantic HTML, assistive technologies will understand the aim of each element, the purpose of these elements, the order, the hierarchy, and the structure of the document. For example, for creating a structure, we have these tags. With header, we are telling the assistive technology, this is an introductory part of the document. With nav, that this is a navigation menu. With main, we are telling the assistive technology that this is the main part of the content. With section, we divide the document in sections. And with article, we are indicating that this is a self-containing part of the document. And with footer, we are creating footers. So if we use all of these tags, the assistive technology will understand the structure of this document, and this information will be communicated to the user. However, there is so much more that HTML can do for us. For example, we have headings, H1, H2, and so on. Suppose for a moment that you want to create the most important title on a website. So you use a P tag and make it really big. And then you want to create another title that is not so important, but it's also a title. So you use another P tag and make it smaller. Someone that doesn't have any visual impairment is going to understand that the bigger, the more important. However, someone that has a visual impairment won't get this information, because assistive technologies don't understand about font sizes. How can we communicate this hierarchy to the assistive technologies? Well, if we use semantic HTML, in this scenario, headings, assistive technology will understand. If you use an H1, the assistive technology will understand that this is the most important one on the document, and with H2, it will tell the user that this is an important title, but not so important. And there are many types of semantic HTML tags around there. For example, we have address, that is for addresses, or code, that is for pieces of code, or block quotes, that are for big quotes. So you might be wondering right now, what tag should I use in every scenario? My recommendation is that you take a look to all the semantic HTML tags that exist and try to find the one that fits better with whatever you're trying to create. And if you can't find anything, well, yes, use a div. However, using a div must be our last resource, because divs doesn't carry any meaning, so they are not going to help assistive technologies understand what is going on. So yes, we have to use semantic HTML, but now I want to talk about forms. Forms are really important because they are the main way in which a user is going to interact with our website. However, creating an accessible form can be a little bit challenging. Firstly, it's important that we use label tags and that we link them to each input with the for attribute and the ID attribute. Because otherwise, the assistive technology will understand that this is an input, but won't be able to tell the user the purpose of this input. Label tags tell us the purpose of these inputs. That's why we must use them. Secondly, we must use placeholders. People tend to think that labels or placeholders are the same, but they are not. Labels give us the opportunity to tell what we have to write on this input, and placeholders give us hints about the format that is expected on this input. So we need both of them, as both of them are going to give us important information. On the other hand, let's imagine that we want to give more information to the user. For example, we want to tell him that he can only write letters on this input. We can place this text next to the input. However, this is not going to be enough for an assistive technology, because if someone doesn't have any visual impairment, he will understand that this text is giving us information about this input because they are nearby. However, assistive technology won't get this information. How can we do that? We can use area described by. There are many types of area attributes around there, but today I'm only going to talk about area described by. Area described by tell us that one element is going to be described by another element. How can we use them? On the element that is going to be described in the input, in this scenario, we place the area described by, and inside of it, as a value, we write whatever we want. For example, description. And on the element that is going to give this description, we write the same value we wrote inside of area described by description. This way, the assistive technology will understand that both elements belong together. So yes, now we know how we can create accessible forms, but I would like to talk about links. Picture this. I want to use an assistive technology, a screen reader. As I have told you before, screen readers are devices that tell you out loud what is happening on a website. So you are going to listen to everything that is happening on a website. Sometimes this can be a little bit exhausting, so there is a way in which you can interact with a website only listening to links. This is pretty useful because you are going to be able to move really quickly between pages, because you are going to be listening to the links, and then you will click to the link, and then you will go to another link, and so on. But what if the text of all links are the same, or are something like click here? The person that is interacting with the screen reader, is only going to listen, click here, because you are only listening to the links. You are not getting the context of the link. So that's why when we write our text on our links, it's important that we write descriptive links, because otherwise people are not going to know the destination of each link. Lastly, I would like to talk about images. People with disabilities, with a visual impairment, are not going to understand what is going on a picture. That's why alt attributes were created. Alt attributes give us the opportunity to describe what is happening inside of a picture. Does that mean that we have to describe every picture? Not really. The ones that we should describe are the ones that carry meaning, that are important to understand what is going on. If we have a picture that was placed there only because it's nice or is aesthetic, we can use the alt attribute and leave it empty. If we do that, the assistive technology will understand this element can be ignored. So I have brought to you two pictures, and I'm going to explain how I decided what I was going to write inside of each alt attribute. The first element was a logo of a website I used to have that was called Furisaurus. And for me, it was really important that people understood that my logo was a dinosaur eating pizza and that her name was Rita. So I wrote all this information on the alt attribute. However, the second one is just a poke that is cute. So I left the alt attribute empty. This way, the assistive technology will be able to communicate all this information to the user, and we are able to ignore what is not important. And yes, we have learned about accessibility, but does that mean that we are the freaking masters of accessibility now? Not really. Because I have only given you a few tips to get you started, but you might encounter some situation in which this information is not enough. On these situations, my recommendation is that you take a look to the WCAG. WCAG stands for Web Content Accessibility Guideline, and it's a guideline for creating accessible platforms that was created by the World Wide Web Consortium. Right now, we are on the 2.2 version. Lastly, I hope that everyone that has come to listen to me today has learned something about accessibility, and I hope that now all of you are not committed to create a more accessible website, to create a more accessible world. here are the credits of the presentation, and I would like to thank MadVue for inviting me today because this was my first ever talk in English. And here are the most here are my social media if you want to tell me something. Well, thank you for inviting me.